Hello, everyone. I hope your week is going well so far. Today, we're continuing with another lecture in our Global Newsroom class, and this lecture is about global news environment. So let me share my screen with you and start with the presentation for today. So what makes global news important? What do you think makes global news important? Let's take a look at some potential events. For example, when a natural disaster or any other calamity occurs, news organizations start instantly gathering information. And then when they gather and verify information, then they report that information to a wider audience. Events that fall into this category include earthquakes, tornadoes, tsunamis, but also there are other events that do not present a natural disaster, but that are very important to us as they represent some sort of social deviance, such as violent protests. That is also something that we will be reporting about. In this situation, news about that event becomes as essential as having water and electricity. Because remember, in the first lecture, we talked about how we live in this interconnected world. So something that happens across the sea can affect us as well. And also, it's not just because these events can affect us, but it is also our natural curiosity about what is happening across the globe is what drives us to watch and read these type of stories. Now, what kind of world do we live in? With emerging technologies, and we especially witnessed their spread at the beginning of the 21st, at the end of the 20th century, at the beginning of the 21st century, emerging technologies sped up information dissemination, but they also brought the digital divide. Some groups benefited from new technologies in the past 2 decades, but other groups remain excluded. They remain at the periphery. We talked before about how we divided this world into the global north and global south. So this division has been further emphasized in the past 2 decades because digital technologies have divided the economically rich and industrialized global north and the economically poor and the developing global south. But aside from this division that is evident, the division between countries in the West, like the United States, European countries, Canada, and countries in the global South, such as African countries or Latin American countries, there is also this division between elites and the disadvantaged. So what does this actually mean? It means that not everyone has the same access to global news, to free information, because they don't have the same access to digital technologies. Now, there is another problem that further contributes to this digital divide. When it comes to dominant news creators, they're predominantly concentrated in the West because the West has the means and technologies to collect information, to produce it and distribute it further. These countries in the global south, they don't have the same means to produce technologies. And what is the impact of such a situation in the world? This contributes to the portrayal of global events primarily through the Western perspective, because they have the means to collect, produce, and disseminate information. They dictate how the rest of the world will perceive global events. So it is through their lens that these events are being portrayed. What are some of the key players in this media market? Among them are certainly news agencies or international wire services such as Associated Press, that is based in the US, Reuters, and then AFP. They supply media across the globe with information. So how do these buyer services work? They have more reporters than other news organizations. They are spread all over the globe. They deliver information to they deliver information that they obtain from their reporters. They deliver and distribute it to other news media or other organizations that subscribe to their service, but they have an enormous impact, especially on global news, because they have so much news, they have so many reporters across the globe who work for them. Now, according to some research, almost 90% of non-domestic news, so of those news stories that are related to the events that occur elsewhere in the world, comes from these players, these news agencies. So AFP is based in France. We will learn more about it this semester. Reuters is now Reuters headquarters are now yeah, I want you actually to search for this information because this is a UK organization, but now their headquarters are in Canada. Now, how do we obtain this news, and how does this situation impact our perception of the news? Like, what kind of news do we get from other countries? There is an evident imbalance in global information dissemination, and this imbalance is not only reflected in who is producing the news, and we discussed some of the main global media players, such as Associated Press, AFP, and Reuters, but this imbalance is also reflected in from which areas are news coming to other parts of the world. What do you think? From which areas are news actually being distributed to other parts of the world? So, international news flow theory poses that specific factors determine whether a country would make the news or not. What is the impact of the West on the news? According to research, by controlling the major news agencies such as AP, AFP, and Reuters, and global news media, wealthy Western countries hold the key to the flow of international news. And I just cited a study that I worked on with my colleague who works at the University of Georgia. We were actually trying to determine how global media report on events that are happening elsewhere in the world. So, and according to the research so far, wealthy Western countries affect this distribution and production of news. So what happens is that news traffic primarily happens among the countries of the core, so the countries of the West, putting countries of the periphery at the disadvantage. And as I mentioned, these countries at the periphery are those countries that are underdeveloped, that belong to the global South. Now, there are certain determinants that would tell us whether we are likely or not likely to report on some event that is happening abroad. There are actually two approaches to the international flow of news. The first approach is context-oriented approach, and that approach is primarily concerned with politics, economic relations, cultural and geographic proximity. So if we find certain, let's say, economic relations with the country in which just with the country with another country, we're likely to report on it. So if we have strong economic relations, if we have political ties, if there is geographic proximity, we are likely to report about issues happening in those countries. So you frequently see the news coming from France, from the United Kingdom, and it is because there is a long tradition of there is a strong political and military and economic connection between the United States in those countries, and that is why you're likely to read more reports about those countries than some countries, let's say in Asia or in Africa. Another thing is event-oriented approach. So this approach emphasizes the deviance of events. So what does it mean? Well, how are we, what happens to the international news flow if we look at the event-oriented approach? So if there's something, if something big happens, such as an earthquake or a tsunami, or if there is a big protest that is going to turn into a major social change in the country, then we are likely to read news about it because Western countries find this to be relevant, find this to be important. The event itself is has a huge impact on that society, or maybe on many other countries surrounding that one. It is likely that we're going to report about an event happening there. So what scholarly research has found so far is that the most frequently employed determinants of the international news flow include geographic proximity, deviance, the presence of news agencies, language, and event relevance. This is why we reported on the earthquake in Haiti. The event itself was so impactful that you can find reports on it in news media that were just being delivered for an extended period of time. Also, looking into geographic proximity, you will frequently read news about what things that are happening in Canada. And this is, again, because of geographic proximity, but also because of our ties with Canada. Another important thing, presence of news agencies. So if news agencies such as Associated Press or AFP have reporters in those countries, then it is likely that we will read the news from them. And they strategically pick which countries they're going to send their reporters to, where they're going to have their foreign correspondents to report on events. Another thing that research has also found is that traditional imbalances in the coverage are replicated on the web. So this international news flow theory and how media report on events abroad, it was focused for a long time on traditional news organizations, traditional news media such as television, radio, and print. But then over time, it also started exploring how news organizations that have their online websites report on events abroad. And even though on one hand, like when we look at news websites, we will certainly find more information coming from abroad simply because there is more space online to report on global events. But also remember that regardless of this, they still look at the same variables to decide whether they're going to report on an event or not. How impactful the event is. Is this country where the event is happening or some other problem is happening? What is geographic proximity? What are our political, economic, and cultural ties to that country? These are some of the reasons why we're going to report on that event. Now, I want you to stop for a moment and look at the essay question that I have for you, and I want you to complete this before we meet in person. So, from your understanding of this lecture, and please make sure to finish it before you write an essay. From your understanding of the course material, what do you think are the main characteristics of the global news environment? What are its main media players? What kind of news and from which countries and sources are we most likely to read? So think about what I discussed so far, and also don't wait, I have more to share with you. So just bear with me and listen to the remainder of this lecture, because you will find some answers to these questions there. So your essay should be about 300 words and then posted in classes under global news environment before we meet. Now, who controls this international news flow? So media conglomerates and news organizations, much of the international media is dominated by conglomerates, including Rupert Murdoch's. He is an Australian media baron, then Disney Company, Time Warner, and Sony in Japan. People across the globe receive their news from different areas of the world through various news media, including, but not limited to the following news organizations: the New York Times, the BBC, the Guardian, Daily Telegraph, Al Jazeera, Le Monde. So we'll definitely talk about all these news organizations in more detail this semester. International editions. Many newspapers and magazines have international editions, but they actually had them in the 20th century. Many of them decided to stop publishing those editions in the second decade of the 21st century. The reason for that, we talked about it, circulation has plummeted. They realized that they couldn't afford to print these magazines and newspapers anymore abroad. And also, as I mentioned before, a lot of these big companies switched online. They decided to offer subscription to the people across the globe. So somebody in France or in Italy or in Canada can simply access the New York Times by subscribing to it. So there are no limitations any longer, and or they can subscribe to the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post. What happened to all these magazines and newspapers? So the Wall Street Journal, for example, gave up on its print edition in Europe and Asia due to plunging print advertising revenue. So they just couldn't afford to keep printing the paper. And similarly, the International Herald Tribune, owned by the New York Times and published in Paris, ceased to exist in 2013. So we don't have these papers anymore abroad. But again, they can access news published by the New York Times and Wall Street Journal online with subscription. Global television news. So aside from these big players that I introduced that belong to the print or digital media spectrum, people across the globe, and some of the most important players include CNN and BBC. CNN stands for Cable News Network. Their headquarters are in Atlanta, and it is one of the most recognizable media organizations worldwide. I'm not sure if you watch them, if you have cable television, and this is like one of the sources to go to for international news, but you can also access for free. And many people do this. They simply access their content for free online on their website. CNN is seen in more than 200 countries, and it reaches around 260 million households worldwide. So you see how impactful this TV station is. This network is especially important during an international crisis as it provides constant updates of the story. And I remember like when I worked as a journalist and before we had all these social media platforms and the internet, we would watch CNN live to see what was happening in other parts of the world. So if a breaking news event occurs, CNN, it was the source to go to obtain live updates about that event. As its reporters are available worldwide, political leaders and diplomats are willingly interviewed on CNN. So this is another reason to why CNN is such a prominent source. So these prominent sources have prominent guests, and this is how we are able to obtain any important information through these interviews with prominent individuals across the globe. It is a well-known station, and pretty much any political leader in the world would be willing to be interviewed by the CNN. Another important and relevant player is the BBC. BBC stands for the British Broadcasting Corporation. In 1991, the BBC started its own world service television that is also available through cable. The television changed the name to BBC World in 1995 and to BBC World News in 2008. BBC World News is the BBC's international news and current affairs TV channel. Also, just like CNN, it is a global media player. And if you would like to get like updates about what is happening across the globe, then this is the source to go to. This TV channel has the largest audience of any BBC channel. So now let's take a look at the personnel. Who works for these news organizations? Who does the reporting for Associated Press, for BBC, for CNN? So before, news organizations such as Associated Press, they used to have an American correspondent who would cover an event in another country. But with increased professionalism of local journalists, news agencies started hiring local journalists. So another thing that they do is they train local journalists. So it's much easier for them. And if it is cheaper to hire local journalists than to send an American journalist abroad. And I remember when I was a journalist in Serbia, I actually had a training at Reuters on how to report political economic news. So basically, they do want to transfer this news philosophy or news practice that they encourage to other nations. And they also want to tomorrow hire somebody from that region to report for them because they're trained to report for them. What are some of the benefits? So aside from the fact that it's usually cheaper to hire a local journalist versus to send journalists from the West to cover events in another country. Aside from that, the key benefits are actually that local professional journalists know their country well, they know the context well, they know its language, and they know its social and political traditions. So they understand the situation better when they report on it. And then they're also better connected to local institutions and politicians than a journalist who would come from abroad. Now, what are some of the issues that surround news media across the globe? So some of the problems include falling circulations. So basically, print media are almost disappearing, and there is declining audiences. So how the number of people interested in watching the news, but also media are struggling with advertising losses because of free online media and because a lot of these advertising losses occur because Google, because companies decide to advertise through Google, Yahoo, Facebook, and other players instead. Now, let's see what is it that we learned in this brief lecture about global news environment. First of all, there is an evident digital divide between the industrialized global north and the economically poor global south. And this divide is also reflected in the amount of information they're receiving and access to news and digital technologies. Another thing is the dominant news creator in the global ecosystem are Western countries. And this also means that news traffic is happening between them. And their perspective is dominant in global news. Another thing is imbalance in global news production and dissemination. So Western countries that are rich, they have the means to produce and disseminate information much more than countries that are at the periphery. So this is why we have imbalance in global news production. And news media across the world heavily rely on various services. So if you go to almost any news website and click on their world or globe section, you will see how much information comes from Associated Press, AFP, or Reuters. And the international media is dominated by media conglomerates. We learned about Rupert Murdoch. We will learn more about him this semester, but we also will take a look at other big media conglomerates that basically also control this international news flow. Now, among the major global news players, and I want you to remember this, we'll talk also about them in more detail. They include Associated Press, Reuters, CNN, BBC, the New York Times, Al Jazeera, The Guardian. These are just some news organizations, but there are many more that we are going to discuss. Now, these are my references for today. I also included one of the studies that I published in 2019 about the international news flow. And thank you very much for your attention and enjoy the week. And I will see you soon. Bye.